And that's the interior.
Yes,
yes, and what it was like some time ago.
Yes, that's the sort of turn of, it's 1885, when it was just used as sort of farm buildings, that sort of thing.
And that's the little section of the original kind of cloister structure.
Yes, that's right, yeah. Some debate as to actually what height it was, but...
Yes, because we now think that was probably 5 stories high, the gatehouse.
It's supposed to be more glorious than Hampton Court its day.
Bigger.
And bigger too,
Yeah.
yes.
And we built just before Hampton Court too.
I think you probably commented before that middle bit probably wouldn't have been grass.
Absolutely not.
That it would have been
cobbled. As they put back at Hampton Court, yeah.
Yes.
Excellent. And these are bits and pieces found there, are they?
Well, all sorts. This is probably part of the whole.
Just put a few little bits up to do with them.
This chap was quite interesting. He was of Oxford, and he finally worked out that he needed an engine for this plane, which is called the Hawk. And he left all the plans, and it was being made, the engine. He got the plane itself, but he managed to kill himself, unfortunately, just prior to putting the engine in the plane. But I think it was in 2003 when the centenary of the Wright brothers flight, there was a big sort of documentary on this chap, and they remade his aeroplane at Dundee University and made the engine he was going to put in it. And then they said, well, if it takes off, for more than 20 seconds, he would have done more than the Wright brothers. This is sort of 5 years before the Wright brothers, and they actually got it up in the air, and they found they couldn't get it down, and in the end they had to actually crash it because they were running out of airways. But they said the only thing that he would have had to have done was to have actually strung a seat, because he was hanging on by his elbows. But it would have been fairly sort of obvious that he needed a seat to sit in. But so if he hadn't have sort of killed himself, he probably would have been the first man sort of
power flight.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh well. Lots in the end.
Yes, we've got a timeline round here which helps people understand when things happened.
Yes, well, as a result of the talk this afternoon, I think you're going to have to alter the whole of the early Henry VIII. it's the only moment that Warham is really politically important. I'd be astonished if he's not building right through the 1520s.
Really?
Yeah, just keeping on. Well, look at it, it's this immensely sprawly structure.
Yes.
And I think the evidence is very clear that if you look at Wolsey, Hampton Court is never finished. Henry VIII's palaces are never finished. They're being added to and added to and added to, and every sort of little shift of fashion, something else appears. I mean, people again talk about the King's apartments at Hampton Court. You can't identify one because they're constantly being added to. The first lot are in at the back of the second court, which are the ones which were originally the huge 3-story structure at the back of the Great Hall that's created by Wolsey, and of course the fragment of the watching chamber and so on survives for that. But then he creates at least 2 other sets as the reign goes on, and including the whole of what is now Fountain Court, which is effectively rebuilt in the 1540s. And Wolsey's the same. It's adding. I mean, the galleries are nearly always added on. I mean, they are exactly the sort of feature that you think, oh gosh, I put a garden here, I would like a gallery either to take me to it or to overlook it or whatever. And you know, by the end of, by the time Wolsey's fall, 1529, again at the Moor, which is a house that he'd spent an absolute fortune on, he's still building a gallery. So as I said, don't have this idea of it's finished.
One thing we've recently discovered on the model, we've got all of the towers the same height, but in fact Ireland, in his history about 1828, actually says that the central gatehouse was 2 stories higher.
I think that would be right.
I always think it looks a bit dumpy.
It looks dumpy, and so the problem again at Hampton Court is that the inner gatehouse was originally at least 2 stories higher.
Than it is today.
Yeah, because that's an 18th century rebuild. It's a William Kent rebuild. Right. Thank you very much. And the remains of the arcade.
I think this was sort of built up about 1900. It was changed from that picture we saw to back again.
This, of course, is the reason that Henry VIII hated it. The water.
Because it lieth low.
And there's too much water.
Yes.
It was in the stream, and you know, it was wonderful.
Oh, so going back to now.
Castle house.
Castle.
Well, Victorians called it a castle.
Oh, did
because they didn't know it was a palace.
How interesting.
That's my little calculator. The picture is in behind the front doors there, and that's my view. That's what I'm about to do. So I can change the garden.
See the well first and then...
And obviously the run through here, he's filled and knocked over.
My gardeners have cleaned out the bottom of it there, so you can see.
They assume underneath here there's a Roman foundation, but whether it is or not, no one really knows. But this is Beckett's well, this and that bit, you know, and I think the other bits have been sort of added to, but this would have been it.
Oh, well that's really, because I was led to believe by the lady from Ancient that this was almost a mirror of that.
Yes.
And all these banks, I mean, when you did your excavations in 1950, presumably these banks weren't here.
French fountain in the middle of the village. Is that right? Is that the way it works?
No idea.
You're looking too for
No, I have no idea. No idea. In any case, there's a river. You don't need springs.
Well, in terms of the Darren, absolutely.
You don't need springs.
This is a freshwater spring that comes out of the chalk hills.
Yeah.
That feeds this.
But that you have, I
You
think,
can't drink river water, can you, or can you?
Well, they never drank water.
Oh, okay.
They drank beer.
sorry?
Where is the boundary of the palace?
What's up here, you mean?
Oh, well, no, it's further down, because we can tell you that, because obviously part of our land is protected. And there's a point where it ends, and actually it's the edge on the side of,
it's
on the
rather
edge of the
nice.
tennis court.
Is it nice and warm?
Because they couldn't put the tennis
Oh,
court
yeah.
close to the house, to the land.
He's wearing his shoes on.
And his socks. And his socks.
So are you going to explain how cold that is?
It's, honestly, it isn't cold.
Well, I think what Andrew always said to me, it ran at a constant 42 degrees. So.
Yeah, it's not too bad at all.
Right.
I mean, I'd rather do this than go in the sea.
Well, fine.
You also wash. The Middle Ages wash. We only really get very dirty in the 16th century, once we get religion, which is associated with nakedness. Nakedness becomes a bad thing. So the Middle Ages are quite keen on washing. So you need it for cooking. All of those things. But
Just a collection point for water.
I would imagine so. Yeah. I mean, and also, does this stream flow down to the palace?
Yes, it does.
Right. Well, there's your explanation. It's the water supply of the palace.
Hence why.
Yes, that's what it is. There's no romance It's the water supply of the palace, and Otford would. Otford, like Hampton Court, would have had piped water. And bearing in mind how fashionable Warren was, he might well have had hot water in his own private rooms, because you had, certainly Henry VIII and Wolsey had the facility of hot bathing. No, I think just as we do, just hot water. But that's all that's all it will be. It will be the water supply of the palace. So it'll feed the palace kitchens. There'll be a palace laundry, all that sort of thing.
So would they actually have come up to this point, or was it just merely there to feed the palace?
Well, you'd have fed the palace. There would have been pipes.
Sort of inevitably they came up here and bathed in it.
Oh, how ridiculous! Maybe earlier on, but if I imagine, I don't know. A structure like that, I think, can only have been a reservoir.
But it's jolly,
it's beautifully built. Presume. What do your chaps say? Do they think there's clearly a break in the brickwork, in the stonework? Yeah. Do they think it was originally as deep as this?
Well, there's lots and lots of talk about that, and
right.
Not, I don't know what.
Because that's old stonework going back there, and it's immensely thick.
It is. Yeah.
I would have thought it's a reservoir.
So at one point the water level must have been quite...
Would have been high, because you want pressure.
Which would have been great when they had the trout farm.
That's right, yeah. But I would, we've things like the Charterhouse in London. It took its water supply from Islington, which of course is much higher. So you have heads of water. And and we've been slightly climbing, I think, from the palace. So I think that's what it will be.
All the pens going down.
Yes.
And they have the you could aerate by the fall.
Yes, you could do that. But I would again, as far as I can see, there's no evidence there's any other ancient structure below that.
No.
Now, what is your when you look at that wall and you look at all of this, I don't see, and I know nothing, absolutely nothing about it, but to me logic says that that's not connected. And also there seems to be a lot of the river that...
Well, that wall isn't strong enough to hold up this lot of water anyway. Well, is it? I mean, look in comparison with that there.
I did appreciate the irony of that, yeah.
Am I right again, David? Is what was
Well, it could be partial. Heaven knows what they intended to do.
Look at the pictures from 1950 because then all the vegetation was excellent.
Jenny used to go nuts about this. The door.
Yes, it's all photograph or the insurance, so that if anything happens to be reproduced. What's it actually taking?
Pallium is the strange cross on the left side of it.
Yes, which is actually, it's a symbol of the office of art.
That was part of our badge.
Hey, stop blithering, you lot. This end here is original Tudor. Look at the base of the stack.
Wait, listen, come here, quick.
Did you know that this end of your house is Tudor? Look at those details of the curves on either side there.
So,
right.
That is actual Tudor brick in there.
Right.
You've got Tudor brick in the centre of that panel there.
Right.
And this is all obviously the same bricklayers who do the courtyard of the palace.
Right. Mark, did you hear that?
You better come, pay attention.
Stop doing your own research and listen to somebody.
Just following instructions.
Oh, right. You don't need the
Mark, this is did you know this is actually clearly built by the same builders as the palace?
Isn't that
And the same decorative brickwork. Look at it. It's the same. If you go and look at the courtyard side of the palace, where there's the arcade, it's the same. They're the same brick forms. Look at this curve here on either side, which are very early Renaissance features. They're primitive brackets. Is there a big fireplace?
Yes, enormous. Yes. See, we're led to believe, or indeed the heritage, sort of with the information that we have, this is possibly a farm here.
Far too grand.
Far too grand.
Far too grand.
Far too grand. It was never a farm building.
That's not a farm building.
No.
No farmer will possibly do that. No, it's much too elegant.
So what do you think it's?
I have no idea. I would need to look at it on a map.
Really?
But that's so extravagantly built.
Right.
And so unusual.
That's not for you, David.
What happened between the 16th century and now?
But he's saying they've all got
Down the fake phrase, I think that's
Well, I'm not going to get any bloody. Are we talking Warham or Durham? Warham. Yes. Okay. So type in here. You see, Oxford Archbishop's Palace. So, coat of arms for Archbishop.
Yeah, 3 shells.
3 shells.
And 3 shells on a stag's head. It's Warham.
We've pieced a little history together.
This is like one of those days sort of.
Well, actually, David, you've hit it on the nail, because actually this is, guess what, 3 shells on a stag's head with the Archbishop's thing on the head. So there we go, that's Archbishop Durham. Warham.
I think this could this is an archiepiscopal property.
And maybe it was actually an Archbishop's property. Or maybe it was, actually they just went round and said, I want that property. So maybe they just took possession of it.
No. They owned almost all the land. But there you are. You see, that's the form that you have there exactly.
Yes, precisely. Yes, 3 shells. Yeah. Isn't that brilliant?
They've altered the.
Well, I'm so glad I showed it to you.
Does this put the value of the property up any?
If it does, I get a cut.
With a letter from David.
Just put that in writing and sign for it.
Canterbury won it back, actually.
I know, but that's really interesting.
Well, you see, I mean,
do you
which
think it's
all the more reason why we should really look at having it.
But is it its original form?
The thing that you'd need to find that out would be to look at what the half timbering underneath the plaster of the brick is.
We are extremely privileged to have him here with us today. He's here now to talk to us about Archbishop Warham, and I know that we will all give him a very warm welcome. Thank you.
Leslie Rector, thank you. The last time I stood in the pulpit, I was a sixth former, and I was playing Thomas Becket in Murder in the Cathedral. And at the end of it, a wise headmaster came up to me and said, Starkey, you would have made a very good bad cardinal. So I regard myself as being extremely well qualified to speak on this subject. Now, Warham is, as I'm told by members of its family, how we ought to pronounce it, no E, W-R-H-A-M, Warham. Warham is one of those great known unknowns, to purloin the phrase of Rumsfeld. He is one of the most memorable faces of the early 16th century. Anybody who knows Holbein knows the great portrait of Archbishop Warham. It shows a man who looks as old as the oldest turtle, and with a face that's remarkably similar, deeply hooded eyes, a powerful nose, long, as it were, lines of age etched into his face. Now, there are very good reasons for that. He's well into his 70s. He is 80 when he dies, and he is the second longest serving Archbishop of Canterbury, with just under 30 years in the job. But it's not only the face that strikes you in that picture, with the combination of cunning and obstinacy. It's also the wealth of the man. There is a huge mitre, the kind of mitre that Anglican bishops can only dream about nowadays. It's about 2 foot high, made of the finest silk and covered with jewels. astonishingly rich jewels. There's an enormous archiepiscopal cross propped up casually on the wall behind him. Again, massive jewels around the image of the suffering Christ. And there is an incredible, his hands are resting on a hugely rich silk brocade cushion. This clearly is a man who is both a man of the cloth, but also a man of damask and silk, and obviously vastly rich and vastly powerful. He's also famous in some other ways as well. Those of you who are at all familiar with the early 16th century will be familiar with the great humanist Desiderius Erasmus, and the great scholar, the Dutch scholar, although he'd almost certainly forgotten to speak Dutch, he spent the whole of his time speaking Latin, and the great Dutch scholar who spends so much of his time in England. And Warren is his principal and much beloved patron. And in the letters exchanged between Warren and Erasmus, there's another aspect of the man, a rather wicked sense of humour. He spots the fact that one of Erasmus's servants meeting him in Westminster Hall, which gives you a wonderful sense of the geography of the Tudor Palace and all the rest of it, has an unbelievably bald head. And he spots this glowing pate in the middle of Westminster Hall. The reason why you spot it, of course, is that because he's meeting the second most powerful man in England, which Archbishop Warren is, as Archbishop of Canterbury, he's obviously taken his hat off, so he's uncovered this amazing glowing pate in the dim light of Westminster Hall. There's a rather sort of uncomfortable exchange of letters with Erasmus on the subject of kidney stones, in which Erasmus uses the phrase petlam, in other words, rock, in the accusative, which of course is the famous Petrine phrase, on this rock I shall build my church. And Warren and Erasmus play games with the word. Erasmus is using it to mean an agonizing kidney stone. Warren is using it to mean here, Oxford, the building of his palace. And it goes on, this curious sense of the mixture of magnificence, of power, of wealth, of humour, and above all, I think, a sense of character. Now, the Erasmus letter, the Holbein portrait, I think are all that most people in England know of, despite that 30 years as Archbishop. You here in Oxford know something else. You know the palace. By the way, those of you who don't know the Holbein portrait, yes you do, you walk past it every day. It's part of your Millennium mosaic, right in the middle there, and actually quite a good version of it, though without the richness of the background. But you in Oxford also have, sadly, fragmentary remains of Oxford Palace, the fantasy palace that Warren builds as Archbishop. Now, the palace is only a fragment, and if I dare say it, a sadly and deplorably neglected fragment as it stands at the moment. But once it was grand, and if you go to your Heritage Centre, if I'm sure most of you have done, you will see a rather impressive and pretty, I would have thought, authentic model. And this suggests a building on the same scale as Hampton Court. A building equal in magnificence, in ostentation, and what's even more interesting, and I had occasion to rediscover this afternoon when I was walking around on the property in the village, innovation. This is a building of somebody who is the absolute cutting edge in architectural development. You have one of the gems, admittedly broken, smashed and lying in bits on the ground, of the Tudor Renaissance here in your village. So what sort of man builds that? What kind of ambition is involved in this? What sort of wealth and power did he have? And is he really as colourless as he seems? Because, of course, I suppose Warren seems especially colourless for two reasons. First of all, in terms of direct power under Henry VIII, He's succeeded by the other figure in my title, by Wolsey. Now, anybody who is succeeded by Wolsey has a tough time. It's like trying to succeed me as a lecturer, you know. It's really very, apart from Simon Sharp, it's difficult to do it, you know. And even he doesn't always succeed, but there we are. Wolsey is this astonishing figure, if you think of Shakespeare's Henry VIII. He's the only figure you remember in Shakespeare's Henry VIII. He's this figure in red, this blazing cardinalic red, this unbelievable, powerful, arrogant character, exuding life, vitality, a kind of porcine, a piggy sense of power and greed and grasp. And he's the perfect politician. In other words, he wouldn't have done an Andrew Mitchell. You know, he trod on toes from every duke in England downwards. He wouldn't have apologised to some clever policeman. The only person he kneels to is Henry. That's the only person. He only kneels to Henry for a purpose. So against that, obviously, you pale into significance. He also, in one sense, pales into significance against his direct successor as Archbishop of Canterbury, of course, who is the real founder, along with Henry VIII, and there he is in the vestry here in this church, of the Church of England. And Cranmer is one of the most remarkable figures again in our history, not simply for that strange doubleness and ambiguity which enables him to swear an oath to the Pope to protect the power of the Church in England at exactly the moment that he's plotting to undermine it and destroy it permanently. Cranmer was a very ambiguous man, towards the end of his life, to be reconciled to Rome, and then when he's told he's going to be burned anyway, to discover that his conscience is Protestant all along. A very double, interesting figure, but then Archbishop of Canterbury do have problems, don't they? Including present ones. He then is also a much more dramatic and figure about whom we know far more. At least we thought we knew far more. What I want to do this afternoon, this evening with you, is to suggest we know much more about Warren than we thought. In other words, I want to give you effectively new research and to discuss with you and to be very willing to debate with you in questions how we know what we know. There's a great difference between a historical novelist, of whom there are now far too many, and historians, is that the one who knows and the other guesses in that sense. But knowledge depends on evidence, and I'll be very willing to discuss that with you. So let's just first of all get a sense of the context. We still have an Archbishop of Canterbury. He is the palest shadow of the medieval archbishops of Canterbury. The first thing to understand about the medieval archbishops of Canterbury, that's right up to Thomas Cranmer, is they are as rich, if not richer, than any duke. They are probably the richest person in the country under the king. Again, we've got to imagine an entirely different world. We've got, nowadays, the church scrabbles and begs and borrows, and you all have ring and buy sales and God only knows what to keep the fabric of this church as handsome and beautiful as it is. In the Middle Ages, the church had roughly a third of the land in England. And general rights of taxation of 10% on the income of everybody else. That is more than the king. Remember, there is no regular royal taxation in the Middle Ages. Isn't that a wonderful thought? The only time you pay tax is for a special occasion, which means equally there's no such thing as a regular parliament, an even better thought. You only summon parliament when you want tax, and you only want tax to fight a war. So the church is immensely rich. It's also immensely powerful. To give you a sense of the power of the church, let's think of the scene when Archbishop Warren opens Parliament along with the King in 1510, the first Parliament of the reign of Henry VIII. Obviously, we all know what an opening of Parliament looks like now. The monarch sits in the middle, everybody else below. Not so in the Tudor period. The king indeed sits in the middle, but the Archbishop of Canterbury sits on his right hand, the Archbishop of York sits on his left hand, only one step down. The king is enclosed by the church. Moreover, half of the House of Lords are bishops. And they're the bigger half. Bishops and what are called mitred abbots. That's this pointed hat that I referred to at the back of Warren. And they are, which signify that the abbots are also lords of parliament, because the monasteries, we won't discuss that, but the monasteries also control vast wealth. So roughly 50, 60 of the House of Lords are abbots and bishops. And they occupy the whole of the right-hand side of the Lords. And indeed, they spill over onto the left-hand side of the Lords, because the bishops, is it 4 or 5 or whatever it is, of the province of York, the northern province, sit at the top of the right-hand bench, and only below the humblest of the bishops, that's the bishop, I think, of Carlisle, sits the first duke. So Parliament is dominated by the clergy. And the power of the clergy goes much higher. Because the clergy are not only hugely independently wealthy, other bishops like the Bishop of Winchester, the Bishop of Ely, what's the next richest? It's Winchester, Ely, and it's not even York, I can't remember. But the bishops of Winchester and Ely are almost as rich, despite how tiny Ely is, it's got vast estates, they're almost as rich as the Archbishop of Canterbury. So the bishops are hugely important territorial landowners, and of course in Tudor England, medieval England, land is power. So all of them have these magnificent houses, like Oxford, in the country, but also town palaces. The palace of the Archbishop of Canterbury, of course, is still Lambeth. And it matches the King's Palace of Westminster. You've got Westminster on one side of the river, you've got Lambeth on the other. Even more magnificent, oddly, was the town palace of the Archbishops of York, which is Whitehall. Well, that gives you the scale of this. So it's not only wealth. The clergy, of course, have a near monopoly for most of the Middle Ages on serious literacy. We use the word clerical to mean a worker who is dependent on reading and writing. We talk about a clerk. It meant originally a clergyman, clericus. So the clergy run the administrative machine, not only of the church, because the church, remember, is almost independent of the state. The church has got its own law courts. The church has got its own system of law, known as canon law. Everything to do with the church is controlled by itself. This is the origin of the child abuse scandal, the notion that the church protects its own. This is Becket again. Remember, Becket dies for the right of clergymen to commit crime. You all realise this, don't we? That's what Becket is fighting for. Touch not mine anointed, right? That's what there's no doubt whose side he would have been on in child abuse. It's a terrible thing to say, but that's what he's doing. He's defending the right of clergy to commit crimes without being punished by the secular courts. That's what but you see, what is wonderful about history, we have to get ourselves into a different world. We have to think, this is why Rome has taken the line that it's done on child abuse. It's not a local problem. It's not a problem that's limited to the 20th or 21st century. It's part of a particular clerical mindset that sees the power and the privilege of the church as being the foundation of salvation, the foundation of Christianity. It's very difficult to see, if like me you're born a Quaker, how this relates to the Bible, but let's forget about that. The Bible was a very long time ago by that point, and as one of the clergy said to, I think it's Thomas More or was it Erasmus, If it came to a choice between the Bible and canon law, he was absolutely certain that canon law was what really mattered. And this was a very common attitude. So the clergy then have this control of a huge administrative machine. But the irony goes even further. The clergy run the king's administrative machine. And more than half the king's council, that's the equivalent of the cabinet, are clergy. And what's even more extraordinary, the leading officers of state, with the exception of the Lord Treasurer, who is always a layman, the leading officers of state, the Lord Chancellor, still with us just, the Lord Privy Seal, very much still with us, and the Secretary, of course, who is the origin of all the modern secretaries of state, are invariably clergymen. And what's even more striking is almost always the most important officer of state, the Lord Chancellor, is Archbishop of Canterbury. You hold this double office. So you are at one and the same time, and this shows you what, again, extraordinarily different world this is from what we imagine. You are the Pope's direct representative in England. When we were over at Castle House Farm, I think it's called, this afternoon, we discovered Warren's coat of arms, actually on the canopy over the doors. And this gives you the sense very clearly. What does one side of the coat of arms show? It shows what's called the pallium, the narrow strip of white wool that goes like that and then hangs straight down the front, which is the symbol of the office of Archbishop, is blessed by the Pope and sent over to England and solemnly put round his neck. So there he is as the Pope's representative. But on the other side of his coat of arms are his arms as head of the family of Warren. In other words, one of the king's own subjects. And what's even more extraordinary, and here again, the first piece of original research, I'm the first person to spot this, when Archbishop Warren turned up to open that first Parliament of Henry VIII, we've actually got a representation of it. It's one of the very earliest parliaments. It's actually Parliament of 1512, but I'm sure it's using the material from Parliament of 1510. We've got portraits of everybody in taking part in the laws. They don't bother about the Commons, are of no significance, of course. Everybody who matters in the laws, in the procession on their way to Parliament. And there you have Archbishop Warren. He's dressed as an archbishop, of course. He's got the great mitre. He's carrying his huge episcopal staff, and behind and before him is carried the great cross of Canterbury. Well, that's fine, that's what we would expect. And he's wearing the red as an archbishop's parliamentary robes, fine. On his chest and on the top of each arm, as kind of epaulettes, are the arms of England. In other words, he's both the Pope's and the King's. So, that gives you some sense of what it is to be Archbishop of Canterbury. It is the summit of ambition. It's the summit of ambition of somebody who is not born into the nobility. And here again, it's worth looking at Warren's origins. We are agonizing at the moment on the question of social mobility. How do we get people of modest background into elite universities? And we talk as though the getting of them there into elite universities is a kind of product of, state socialism of the 20th century, the levelling society that's followed the Second World War and all that lot. Can I gently remind you of the cardinals and archbishops that we mentioned? Not a single one of them was born into a respectable family. Wolsey's father is a butcher. Quite prosperous butcher, but he's a butcher. Warren's father, well, somewhere, possibly a farmer, this sort of thing, really, really modest background. And this is absolutely typical of the bishops of the Middle Ages. A handful of them, Archbishop Boucher, the great northern families, like the Percys and the Nevilles, because they effectively run the north as a private fiefdom, tend to get their own men into Durham and into Carlisle, the border bishopric. curates. So there are quite a few Percys and Nevilles. There's the odd Courtenay, which is another very important noble family. But most medieval bishops are of obscure origins. They get there on the basis of one thing, it's talent. Their talent spotted as young boys in villages like this, a local clergyman, perhaps a local gentleman, perhaps the lady, the lady of the house or whatever, spots them. They pay for them to go to intensely disciplined schools. Warren goes to Winchester. And from Winchester, he goes to New College, Oxford, and he has a stellar career. This is typical. Wolsey, we're not quite sure where he goes to school, but he goes to Magdalen College, Oxford. Thomas Cranmer goes to Jesus College, Cambridge. The Church of England, by the way, is entirely the creation of my own university. The Catholic Church, of course, is largely a product of Oxford, always a bit behind the times. But there we are. But this, again, is very important to remember. These are people who are entirely self-made. I was once referred to by somebody on The Guardian as that worst of all possible things, a self-made man. Nothing like socialist for snobbery, you understand? So Warren is a self-made man. And when you look at that portrait, and when you look at Otford, I think you can see a self-made man. Otford looks very much like a 19th century stockbroker Tudor type. He's showing he's made it. He's showing he's got the money. So, what sort of things did he do? What do we think now a clergyman does? I mean, what sort of training do we think they receive? Well, we imagine, don't we, they spend endless hours studying the Bible, and they do theology, and they worry themselves to death about the Nicene Creed or something like this. Forget it. Only one of Henry VIII's bishops was a theologian. One. All the rest of them were lawyers. Which is why they're so tough and able and brutal. But of course, they don't study common law, the King's Law. You couldn't study common law at university. It's not an available subject at Oxford and Cambridge until the 19th century. The only place that you could study the common law were the Inns of Court in London, which is why the Inns of Court in London look exactly like Oxford and Cambridge colleges. You have exactly the same sort of facilities, the courtyards, the sets of rooms, the Great Hall, the chapel, and so on. What you studied at university was canon law, the law of the church, and you also studied Roman law, the old law of the Roman Empire, which was a kind of international legal system that applied in all international relations throughout Europe, was used in all commercial law, in all maritime law, and so on. And also very heavily influenced the particular law court that Warham, as Lord Chancellor, presided over, which was the Court of Chancery, which is the kind of appeal court within the English common law system, where otherwise the idea of appeal isn't known. So Warham is a lawyer. And Warham's entire career is founded on the fact that he is a brilliant lawyer, a magnificent public speaker, and also because of his training in Roman law, a highly skilled diplomat. The evidence is pretty clear too. He actually finished off his career in Rome. We find this difficult to believe, nowadays. How many of our students sort of disappear off and do a higher degree in Rome, or sort of, finishing school in New York? Well, a few more than they used to, but it's still extraordinarily rare. If you look at the upper echelons of the church in the late 15th century, I reckon of all the high flyers, something like 50% of them have a stage in Italy in their career. See what I mean? These people are not only the king's servants, they're a Euro elite. Remember, if we want to put the church into the fact that, of course, England forms part of the Roman Church, if we want to put it into a modern context, it's like the European Union. It's no accident whatever that the treaty that founds the European Union is signed where? Rome. absolutely no accident whatever. And here there is this same sense of a supranational law that goes above the nation state, and a higher duty that you uphold beyond your allegiance to the king, to the head of that supranational institution, the Pope. And if we're to grasp Warham and to understand his values and all the rest of it, it's his loyalty to this supranational institution of the church that he has studied and laboured and understood its law and become a master of it that is the clue to him. So here is this man who is highly skilled, very clever, very ambitious. And he rises through the civil service. He's born about 1450. He rises through the civil service of first of all, in a very minor capacity, the Yorkist kings, and then with the coming to the throne of Henry VII, the king of the first king of the House of Tudor, the House of Tudor. And it's an absolutely classic path. He becomes a sort of deputy chancellor, he becomes master of the rolls when he's in his 40s, and it looks like some kind of really good, decent, middling of the road career. And then suddenly, for reasons that are not entirely clear, within 3 years, he goes from nothing, in other words, master of the rolls, through being Bishop of London, Keeper of the Great Seal, to Lord Chancellor and Archbishop of Canterbury. It's entirely unclear why there is this lightning promotion, but it happens. I've got a guess. I think he is backed by Lady Margaret Beaufort. I think he's backed by Henry VII's mother, who is effectively Queen Mother. She, of course, never sits on the throne herself, but if Henry VII has a title to the English throne, he has virtually none. It derives from Lady Margaret Beaufort. She's a great mover and shaker, and I think she backs Warham. Now, why does she back Warham? Well, I think this also takes us into another very interesting aspect of this world that we're looking at. Warham is a clean pair of hands. He'd had nothing serious to do with royal administration before this point. And above all, he'd had nothing serious to do with the financial administration of Henry VII.